I have been living with my grandparents and younger brother since our mom died from cancer 3 years ago. I'm currently in nursing school and trying to balance clinical rotations, exams, grief, and a family situation that's spiraling out of control. My brother's behavior has progressively worsened since mom passed. It started with small acts of defiance, sneaking out, talking back to our grandparents, but has escalated to something much darker. He's destroyed property, and I once found our neighbor's cat limping after he was just playing with it. He's become physically aggressive too, especially when confronted about his behavior. I've tried multiple times to talk to my grandparents about getting him professional help. They always dismiss everything as teenage rebellion or just his way of processing grief. Our family comes from a very traditional background where we're expected to handle problems internally. There's this massive emphasis on family loyalty above everything else, and my grandmother's favorite phrase is, "We don't air our dirty laundry in public." Yesterday, I came home from a 12-hour clinical rotation to find my grandparents at the kitchen table with a pile of paperwork. My grandfather pushed a document toward me. "You need to sign this for your brother's hearing tomorrow," he said. I stood there confused, still in my scrubs, as they gave me vague answers about some misunderstanding at school involving a girl who was known for causing trouble. After pressing for actual details, my grandmother finally revealed that the school has security footage allegedly showing my brother following a girl into an empty classroom and blocking her from leaving. This wasn't the first concerning incident involving my brother and girls. I found disturbing images on his computer when borrowing it for schoolwork, and there was the time he accidentally walked in on me showering 3 times in 1 week, despite the bathroom door being locked. I told them I couldn't sign the statement because I have a clinical exam tomorrow morning that I absolutely cannot miss, or I'll fail the semester. They've known about this exam for months. I've had it marked on the family calendar since the beginning of the term and reminded them weekly. My grandfather slammed his hand on the table. The family comes before school argument started, with him insisting that my brother needs my support now more than ever and that this could ruin his future. I stood my ground. I explained again about my exam, but then added something I'd been holding back for too long. I'm concerned about brother's behavior patterns. I think the allegations might be true. There was a silence. Then my grandmother burst into tears, sobbing about family betrayal and loyalty. My grandfather pointed toward the door and said, "If I don't support my brother in court tomorrow, I'm no longer welcome in their home." I retreated to my room as I weighed my options and noticed my laptop screen was cracked. Looking around, I realized several of my personal items were missing or moved. My brother had been in my space again, despite the new lock I installed last month. This was the final straw. The pattern was too clear to ignore anymore. My brother wasn't just acting out. His behavior was escalating in concerning and potentially dangerous ways. And my grandparents were enabling him, making excuses, and now forcing me to choose between my education and moral principles versus blind family loyalty. I packed an overnight bag with essentials, texted my college roommate to ask if I could crash at her place, and slipped out while everyone was watching TV downstairs. I felt horrible sneaking away like that, but I knew if I tried to say goodbye, my grandparents would either guilt trip me into staying or my brother would make a scene. As I drove away, my phone blew up with texts from my grandmother, alternating between guilt trips, "This will break your grandfather's heart," and threats, "Don't expect us to pay next semester's tuition." I turned my phone off and focused on the road. The next morning, I aced my clinical exam and turned my phone back on to find 17 missed calls and a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. It was my Aunt May, who somehow heard about what happened. She's always been kept at arm's length by my grandparents, who think she's a bad influence because she moved to the city and abandoned traditional values. When I called her back, she revealed she's been concerned about my brother for years, but was always told by my grandparents that they had everything under control. She also told me this wasn't the first complaint against my brother. Apparently, 2 other girls had reported harassment, but withdrew their complaints after pressure from somewhere. She didn't say it directly, but the implication that my grandparents may have intervened was clear. I've been staying with my roommate for the past 2 days, checking my phone obsessively for news about the hearing. My grandparents have stopped calling, which somehow feels worse than the angry messages. My brother sent one text that just said traitor with a knife emoji. Part of me feels like I'm being selfish for prioritizing my education and my own principles over supporting my family during this crisis. Maybe I should have just signed the statement and gone to court with them, presented a united front like they wanted. But another part of me knows that would have meant condoning behavior that's objectively wrong and potentially dangerous. I've spent 3 years trying to be both sister and mother to my brother, all while pursuing my education and grieving our mom. I've made excuses for him, covered for him, and tried to guide him, but I can't ignore the pattern anymore, and I can't force my grandparents to see what they're determined to overlook. Thanks for reading this far, if you made it. I genuinely don't know if I did the right thing, or if I've just destroyed what little family I have left over principles. Now for the first update. #update. My 20 brother, 16 Emin, was caught following a female classmate into an empty classroom, and my grandparents want me to lie for him. First of all, I did not expect my post to blow up like that. Thank you all for the support and advice during this stressful time. It's helped me feel less crazy about everything. So it's been about 3 days since my last post. I ended up staying at my college roommate's place after leaving my grandparents' house that night. She's been absolutely amazing about everything. I managed to ace my clinical exam the next morning, running on about 2 hours of sleep and a concerning amount of coffee. But I did it. Some of you were worried about this, so yes, I'm not throwing away my education. After my exam, I turned my phone back on and saw missed calls from my grandparents. There were also calls from Aunt May. For context, Aunt May was ostracized by my grandparents years ago for being too modern and abandoning traditional values when she moved to the city and got divorced. You can imagine how well they handle my nursing school ambitions. When I called Aunt May back, she told me she'd heard about the situation through a family friend. What she revealed next was troubling. Apparently, this wasn't just a misunderstanding like my grandparents claimed. She said my brother had been stalking this girl for weeks before cornering her in that classroom. And this wasn't the first complaint against him. 2 other girls had previously reported harassment, but withdrew their complaints after pressure from somewhere. Aunt May didn't say it was my grandparents, but the implication was clear. Several of you in the comments guessed this might be happening. You were right. After talking with Aunt May for over an hour, I realized I needed to grab more of my stuff from my grandparents' house. I figured they'd be at the courthouse with my brother for the hearing, so it seemed like the perfect time to sneak in and get what I needed without a confrontation. Spoiler alert, this plan failed. I drove back to their house around 11 a.m., and everything seemed quiet when I arrived. I used my key to get in and went straight to my room to pack more clothes and important documents. I was gathering my nursing textbooks when the front door opened and people were in the hallway. They were supposed to be at court. I tried to figure out what to do when my brother appeared in my doorway. He looked at my half-packed bag on the bed and said, "Running away because you're scared of me?" I tried to stay calm and continued packing. He mentioned that he saw my text messages to Aunt May last night on my old phone that he borrowed from my room. I didn't know it was missing since I've been using my newer one. When I demanded he give it back, he said he'd return it if I came closer, stepping toward me with his hand outstretched. Before I could respond, my grandfather appeared behind him. Instead of addressing my brother's behavior, he started scolding me for antagonizing my brother on today of all days, because apparently I'm responsible for everyone's feelings except my own. I asked what happened with the hearing, and my grandfather explained it had been rescheduled for next week because the judge was sick. Just my luck, right? My grandmother joined us and noticed my packed bags. They guilt-tripped me about family loyalty and how my behavior was making my brother's situation worse. To be clear, me not supporting him was the problem, not him following girls into empty classrooms. Got it? When I tried to explain my concerns about my brother's pattern of behavior, my grandfather interrupted me, saying I've been influenced by feminist propaganda at my liberal college. Edit, to clarify, my college is a regular state university nursing program, not some radical political institution like they seem to think. They just call anything that encourages critical thinking liberal propaganda. The entire time, my brother watched with amusement. He'd occasionally make little comments designed to make the situation worse, but always with plausible deniability so my grandparents wouldn't notice. I knew I couldn't stay there longer. I grabbed as many of my belongings as I could carry, ignoring my grandparents' threats about cutting me off financially. Joke's on them. I've been working and saving since I was 16 because I never fully trusted their support would last. I called Aunt May from my car and asked if I could stay with her temporarily. She immediately said yes. She's been more of a parent to me in the last 3 days than my grandparents have been in years. As I was driving to her place, I received a text from an unknown number that said, "You can run, but you're still my sister. Family is forever." I knew it was my brother using my old phone. I've saved screenshots of everything, as many of you advised in comments on my last post. Thank you for that. I've been at Aunt May's place since then. She lives about 45 minutes from my school, which isn't ideal for my clinical rotations, but it's safe, and that's what matters right now. She's helped me start documenting everything and suggested I file a police report about my stolen phone and the threatening texts. We're also looking into restraining orders based on some of your advice, though I'm not sure how that works with a minor. The most disturbing part of all this is how Aunt May revealed that my mom had expressed concerns about my brother's behavior before she died. Apparently, my grandparents dismissed them as her being paranoid from the cancer medications. I can't help wondering how different things might be if someone had taken those concerns seriously back then. My grandparents have been blowing up Aunt May's phone now too, alternating between guilt trips and threats. They're saying I've betrayed the family and am making things worse for my brother. They don't seem to understand that I'm not doing this to him. I'm doing this for the safety of others and ultimately for him too. He needs real help, not enablers. I'm mentally preparing myself for whatever happens next, especially with his rescheduled hearing coming up. I promise I'll update again when there are new developments, hopefully positive ones. Now for the second update. Update 2. My brother's hearing is tomorrow and things have somehow gotten even worse since my last post. Which Bato, thank you all for your support. I've read every comment and they've been keeping me sane. I've been debating whether to post again, but after what happened today, I desperately need to process everything. It's been 5 days since I moved in with Aunt Mai. The first thing I did after settling in was file a police report about my stolen phone and the threatening texts. The officer who took my report was surprisingly understanding, especially after Aunt May showed them screenshots of everything I'd been documenting. I was expecting to be dismissed as just family drama. A few of you warned me this might happen. But they took it seriously and added it to their records. A quick note, many commenters pointed out that my brother's behavior shows classic signs of escalation patterns and that I should keep documenting everything for my own protection. You were right, and I'm so glad I listened. The victim's advocate I spoke with yesterday, more on that later, said the documentation will be crucial going forward. Living with Aunt May has been eye-opening in ways I wasn't prepared for. 2 nights ago, after we finished dinner, she pulled out an old photo album I'd never seen before. There were pictures of my mom that I'd never seen, from before she got sick. In one of them, my mom looked worried while my brother stood in the background. Aunt May told me something that keeps me up at night now. Apparently, my mom had expressed serious concerns about my brother's behavior before she died. She'd found mutilated toys in his room and caught him being unnecessarily cruel to our childhood dog. But when she brought it up to my grandparents, they dismissed it as her being paranoid from the cancer medications. Yesterday morning, I got a call from the victim's advocate connected to my brother's case. There's been a major development. A second victim has come forward with similar allegations of stalking and harassment. Because of this, they've moved my brother's court date up to tomorrow instead of next week. The advocate also mentioned they might want me to testify about his pattern of behavior. I want to do the right thing, but the thought of facing my brother and grandparents in court is terrifying. After that call, my phone started blowing up with messages from my grandparents. I ignored most of them until my grandmother called for the 6th time in a row. I know, I should have just blocked them, but there's still this stupid part of me that feels guilty. When I finally answered, it was exactly what I expected. Guilt trips about how I'm abandoning my brother when he needs me most, how family stands together no matter what. I hung up after she started crying about how I'm breaking her heart. This afternoon, I was sitting at Aunt May's dining table reviewing scholarship applications, since I'm pretty sure my grandparents will follow through on cutting me off financially, when the doorbell started ringing. Not just one ring, but repeatedly. Then came the aggressive knocking. Through the peephole, Aunt May spotted my grandparents standing on her porch. So much for having a peaceful day, right? Aunt May opened the door but blocked the entrance with her body, asking what they wanted. I hung back in the hallway. My grandfather pushed past Aunt May. He spotted me and thrust a stack of papers in my direction, saying the hearing was tomorrow and the family needed to present a united front. I backed away, shaking my head. That's when my grandmother collapsed into sobs. My grandfather revealed they hadn't come alone. They'd brought an elder from their community to talk some sense into me. This older man emerged from behind them and explained that forgiveness is divine, and standing by family during trials is what our culture expects of young women like me. I was paralyzed with anxiety when Aunt May jumped in. She told them point blank that enabling harmful behavior isn't what families should do, and referenced how they'd ignored signs of problems for years, including my mother's concerns before she died. I could have hugged her right then. My grandfather turned on Aunt Mai, pointing his finger in her face and accusing her of poisoning me against them. He threatened to cut her out of their will entirely if she continued to harbor me against their wishes. The elder tried to mediate, but made everything worse by suggesting that the assault victim might be exaggerating and that young men sometimes misread signals from girls. Something snapped in me then. I found my voice and told them about everything, the disturbing pattern I'd witnessed for years. I even told them about how my brother killed my cat last year, and they covered it up as an accident. For those wondering why I never mentioned this before, I was still in denial about it myself until recently. They convinced me it was an accident at the time, but looking back at how he showed zero remorse. My grandfather declared that unless I appeared in court tomorrow to support my brother, I was no longer part of the family. My grandmother made one last plea before they finally left, the elder giving me a head shake as he followed them out. I thought that would be the end of today's drama, but about an hour later, Aunt May got a call from a family friend who works at the courthouse. They warned her that my brother was overheard making threats about getting even with me for betraying him. The exact words were apparently something like, "She thinks she can just walk away, but she'll see what happens when you turn on family." I'm trying to stay calm, but I'm terrified. The hearing is tomorrow, and I don't know if I should go to support the victims or stay away for my own safety. The police have been notified about the threat, but they said there's not much they can do preventatively besides documenting it. Aunt May says she'll go with me if I decide to attend, but honestly, I'm paralyzed with indecision. My entire family is imploding, and I keep wondering if there was something I could have done years ago to prevent it from reaching this point. Logically, I know this isn't my fault, but logic isn't exactly winning right now. I'm trying to stay positive despite everything happening with my brother and grandparents. Thanks for staying with me through this journey. Your advice has been more helpful than you know. Now for the final update. My brother's court hearing and the aftermath. It's finally over. First off, I want to thank everyone who's been following this nightmare situation and offering support. Your advice literally saved me when I felt like I was drowning, especially those who told me to document everything. You were absolutely right. The night before the hearing was probably one of the longest of my life. I barely slept and weighed my options. Around 6 a.m., my phone rang. It was the victim's advocate. She told me that my testimony about my brother's pattern of behavior could really strengthen the case and asked if I'd be willing to speak. I told her I needed to think about it. Aunt May made us both coffee, bless this woman, seriously, and we sat at her kitchen table talking through scenarios. She didn't push me either way, just listened while I worked through my thoughts out loud. I kept thinking about my mom and what she'd noticed about my brother before she died. I thought about my cat. I thought about those girls at school. And honestly, I thought about what might happen if nobody stepped in now, what my brother might do next if everyone kept looking the other way. By 8:30 a.m., I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to the courthouse to support my brother like my grandparents wanted. I was going to support his victims by telling the truth. Definitely the hardest decision I've ever made. The courthouse was a building. Aunt May parked her car and squeezed my hand before we got out. The victim's advocate met us at the entrance and immediately took us to a separate waiting room. She explained they were keeping me away from my grandparents and brother because of the threats he'd made, which honestly was a huge relief. While we waited, a woman about my mom's age approached me. She introduced herself as the mother of one of the victims. I was surprised when she thanked me for coming. She said multiple girls had been afraid of my brother for months, but didn't think anyone would believe them. How many other incidents had there been that I didn't know about? When they finally called us into the courtroom, the room wasn't packed, but every single person there felt like they were staring at me. My brother was sitting at a table with his lawyer and our grandparents right behind him. He was wearing a suit, classic manipulation tactic, I realized later. The moment my brother spotted me walking in, his expression changed. That moment confirmed I'd made the right choice. When I was called to testify, the victim's advocate gave me an encouraging nod. I walked to the front, got sworn in, and sat in the witness chair. The prosecutor asked me to describe my brother's behavior patterns at home. I spoke as clearly as I could. I told them everything: how he'd mutilated toys when we were younger, how he'd been unnecessarily cruel to our childhood dog, how he'd accidentally walked in on me showering multiple times, how my phone and laptop would go missing, how my locked bedroom door somehow always got breached. I described finding disturbing images on his computer. And yes, I told them about my cat that ran away last year, except I'd found evidence that suggested otherwise. My grandmother was sobbing the entire time, making sure everyone could hear it naturally. My grandfather just glared at me. When the judge wasn't looking, he mouthed the word liar at me. That would have crushed me a week ago, but in that moment, I just felt nothing. It's weird how liberating that was. My brother's lawyer tried to discredit me, suggesting I was jealous of the attention my brother got from our grandparents after our mom died. He asked why I never reported any of this before if it was so concerning. I explained how my grandparents consistently dismissed, minimized, or excused my brother's actions, making me doubt myself. I mentioned how our family culture emphasized handling problems internally and how I'd been taught that family loyalty came above all else. After my testimony, they showed the security footage from the school. I hadn't seen it before, and honestly, it was worse than I'd imagined. My brother wasn't just following the girl like I'd been told. He was physically blocking her from leaving the classroom, backing her into a corner. I had to look away. The judge seemed particularly troubled by the combination of the footage and my testimony about the pattern of behavior. She ordered my brother to be held in juvenile detention pending a full psychological evaluation. She used phrases like deeply concerning pattern and escalating behavior that validated everything I'd been trying to tell my grandparents for years. The look on my brother's face when they led him away will haunt me forever. It wasn't remorse or fear, it was rage, and it was directed right at me. The scariest part? No one else seemed to notice. They just saw a scared teenage boy, not the person I knew he really was. Outside the courtroom, my grandfather confronted me in the hallway. He got right in my face and said I'd destroyed our family. My grandmother stood behind him, crying silently but making no move to stop his tirade. Aunt May stepped between us. This woman deserves a medal, seriously, and told them both that they had failed both their grandchildren. My brother by ignoring clear warning signs when intervention might have helped, and me by forcing me to parent my own brother when I was just a kid myself. Security noticed the confrontation and came over, asking if everything was okay. My grandfather backed off immediately. Funny how quickly the facade goes up when others are watching. Aunt May took my arm and we walked out together. The drive home was completely silent. I felt this bizarre mix of emotions. Grief for the family I'd probably just lost forever. Relief that my brother's behavior was finally being addressed. And this overwhelming uncertainty about what happens next. I still feel all of those things, honestly, still processing everything. It's been 2 weeks since the hearing, wanted to wait to update until I had more clarity. My brother is still in juvenile detention while they conduct evaluations. According to the victim's advocate, he'll likely be transferred to a secure treatment facility based on the initial assessments. My grandparents have completely cut contact with me, which hurts but isn't surprising. They've also disowned Aunt May, just as they threatened. Aunt May says I can stay with her as long as I need to, and I'm taking her up on that offer while I finish nursing school. I've applied for every scholarship I could find, thanks to those who sent me resources, and picked up some tutoring hours at the Campus Learning Center for extra money. I keep thinking about what some of you said in comments on my earlier posts about how this isn't my fault, how I didn't cause any of this. Logically, I know that's true, but emotionally, I'm still working through it. I've started seeing a therapist, another recommendation from many of you, who specializes in family trauma. It's helping slowly. Edit. A few people have asked about the victims. From what I've heard through the advocate, they're doing okay. The main victim's mother sends me occasional updates through the advocate. She told me that her daughter felt relieved after the hearing and is also getting counseling. The school has implemented a new security policy that came directly out of this incident. So some good is coming from this awful situation. To everyone who supported me through this nightmare, thank you. I genuinely don't think I would have had the courage to speak up without this community having my back. Not being dramatic, just honest. I know the road ahead isn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, I feel like I can actually breathe. This sub helped me find my voice when I needed it most, and I promise I'll pay it forward whenever I can.